Hi everyone, thank you for coming to the event. I'm going to start with introducing the topic to you, and it's called Making Sense of Crowd Sensing Water Data. So in developing and transitional countries, data on water remains scarce and fragmented, and that's largely due to traditional sensing in hydrometeorology, that's a hard word, does not scale due to high investment costs, difficult operation and maintenance of available technologies, and often due to vandalism, usually in the poorer countries. Even when there is data, it is often difficult to access and interpret for local stakeholders, and that's due to outdated data transmission and lack of access to modern tools for data management. So in recent years, there has been substantial developments in technologies that allow for affordable and scalable solutions in water management. And accordingly, this talk by Dr. Tobias Siegfried will focus on insights and learning from the IMOMO initiative, is that how you say it? Supported by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and it focuses on crowd sensing data, which is the topic of our discussion, as well as the application of this data for resource management and conflict management. So a little background on Dr. Tobias Siegfried, who's our guest today. So he is the CEO and co-founder of Hydro Solutions Limited, which is a Swiss-based consulting company focusing on the development and deployment of modern technologies for water resource management, including technologies on crowd sensing data. He has a master's degree in environmental physics from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. He also has a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he also has a PhD from the Institute of Environmental Engineering at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. His work is strongly interdisciplinary. He uses a host of statistical and physical simulation methods for forecasting and optimizing human and environment interactions in the context of irrigation and hydropower production. He has extensive work experience in many regions of the world, including Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and North Africa region, India, Central Asia, the US, and Europe. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Siegfried.
Thank you, Rana, for this kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. I am going to talk today to you a little bit about quite an interesting topic, and I choose the title Making Sense of Crowd Sensing Water Data. So I'm not going to talk about how you can make sense of data that is from crowd sensing, but I try to give you an insight from our experience of this IMOMA initiative, of what we had learned in many places in semi-arid and arid regions. So let me start. This doesn't work, but I can go like this. This is sort of the overview of the presentation. First, I would like to tell you actually what is crowd sensing water data. It's a big word, buzzword, everybody's talking about it, but what does it actually mean? And then where does this initiative come from? And then I would like to give you an example of a technology which has been developed as part of this IMOMO initiative, where you can use a smartphone, an Android smartphone, to measure discharge in irrigation canals or small rivers. And then I would like to discuss with you different users and users for the application of this specific technology, and highlight how context matters actually while discussing crowd sensing. And then I'd like to conclude and have a discussion. I don't know what the culture here is, but if you have questions, just interrupt me, or do you want to do the Q&A at the end? However you feel comfortable. At the end, okay. At the end is Q&A. Wonderful. Okay, so let's get first the definitions right. How I look at crowd sensing is that crowdsourced data collection. is what I call crowd sensing, okay? And this is a type of monitoring performed by a human in whole, which is either an amateur or non-professional. Okay, so that's what I call crowd-sourced water data collection or crowd sensing. Okay, so just to make that clear from the beginning. I'm sure that you will also get the slides afterwards, maybe on the website of the Institute, or you can send me an email, so there's no need to take much notes. Now, it's interesting that if we look at globally, for example, the hydromet sector, we see that there is value in data. And the whole hydromet sector story is actually a large story of failure globally. There is this quite famous study from the World Bank, which estimated benefits from the modernization of the hydromet sector globally, at global scales. And what they distinguished was the benefit on the water resource management sector and the benefit on the disaster risk reduction, the early warning system side. And what is pretty obvious, if you have better data, real-time data, higher coverage in time and in space, you can obviously more effectively and in a more sustainable way manage your resources, which are in our context of interest. Oh, I'm being attacked here. It's better. Yeah. So I'm being wired here, okay. So these data, if we could, at the global scale, modernize hydromet sectors, this study estimated that an additional benefit from better management because of higher data coverage, better data for decision making, about 3 to 30 billion US dollar per year. Okay, so this is quite substantial. And in the context of disaster risk reduction and early warning systems, there is an estimate, global scales again, of 300 million to 2 billion USD per year of avoided losses because of better preparedness, and an estimated 23,000 saved lives per year, which translates, if you want to believe that, you know, how much human life is worth, into something like that. And key take-home message is that the benefit to cost ratio is largely higher than 1. So investments are paying. Now, if we talk about observations and monitoring in water resources, we immediately face a problem. And let me illustrate that problem while showing you a typical irrigation oasis. This is like a GIS picture of a typical large irrigation oasis system in Central Asia. It can be anywhere. What you see here is the river, and then you have the big canals diverting water along the topography onto, in this spider web system, you see here the small canals, everywhere small canals, onto the fields, which are highlighted with this purple color. And you can imagine, if we talk about improving, in this context, for example, water use efficiency for irrigation, that this is a huge task. If you want to get a proper estimate of water use efficiency or crop productivity on a system at the scale like this, because you would have to introduce many measurement points, and when you talk about traditional monitoring, these are static observation network. You would have to increase the density of the static observation network by putting in situ fixed location sensors. And this is obviously not scalable, because it's, if you imagine per station, it's maybe $1,000, $2,000. Then you have to ensure that no vandalism is happening, so you have to protect these sensors, and so on. So this is not really scalable, this conventional station data. This is what I call the traditional data side. Traditional data can also come from remotely sensed data, which is increasingly interesting, especially also in the context of irrigation water management, because you can, the arid, semi-arid regions, you have little clouds, so you can monitor the system, you can look at ET, crop productivity, and all these observations at the system scale. And so this is quite interesting, complementing a static in situ observation network. In recent years, and because of technological advances, people have been becoming increasingly interested in what is called this crowdsourced data, or people-based crowd-sensing data activities, okay? And so this can be viewed very much in a complementary way to the traditional data side, that we develop a new data track for better water resources management, more effective, more sustainable water resource management, by using novel, low-cost, high-tech, people-centered technologies for collecting data and then managing these data in a sort of back-end and using these data in a decision support system and then making better decisions, hopefully based on also these non-traditional crowd sense data. So, and now the question is, can we expect that for our purposes, when we focus on the arid and semi-arid regions at global scale, that people will just use such a technology, for example, using the smartphone for measuring discharge, go out and have fun with this technology and send data to a sort of dedicated database and will be happily living thereafter ever. Okay. And I try to demonstrate to you that it's not so easy, that this whole crowd sensing water data is quite something involved, and that you have to, when you want to do something serious, that you have to go about it in a very dedicated and deliberate manner. So, key take-home message, or one of the key take-home messages from this talk is that you can't just expect that everybody will now be downloading crowd sensing applications, say on their mobile phones, and then go about and measure some interesting variables which can help decision makers to make better decisions at the scale of interest. Okay. One example of atmospheric or crowd sensing activity at global scales from atmospheric variables is this weather observation website, which with the catchy title WOW, which is from the Met Office in UK. So these guys, they provide you a portal where you can go home, you can build your own little meteor station when you are geeky enough. You can 3D print it, and you can put some sensors, and then in your backyard or garden start to measure atmospheric variables, precipitation, temperature, and all these kind of things, and then upload these data in one way or another, digitally or even manually on this website. And you see, at the global scale, this initiative, which has been running for quite some years, is pretty impressive. Also, if you would zoom in and look closely, in many places where you don't have a traditional observation network, you can actually collect data like this. But what is obvious and what is interesting to see, that in the regions of interest, at least in the context of our work, which are the transitional and developing economies, and the arid and semi-arid regions, these kind of initiatives don't really bring much more data. It's really just sort of, okay, we're having enough time, we go about and do a little bit of collecting data in our backyard. It's Commonwealth, of course, it's a European region and the North America region. But in everywhere else, you have some data which are coming in, but really scarce. So you can't just, expect that simply because we have the technology now, low-cost, high-tech, people-centered technology for crowd sensing water, or in this case, atmospheric data, that people will go about this and actually do it. Especially not in the developing and transitional economies. So let me illustrate and tell you a little bit about our experience of this iMomo project, which has been running for 4 years now, and which is, as Rana said in the introduction, which was or is supported, still supported by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. It is a global initiative which at the onset set out and had this goal of fostering innovation in low-cost, high-tech, people-centered, non-traditional observations and monitoring, and in developing some low-cost technologies for the modernization of the pathway from the observation to the decision support, okay? And I can't possibly be talking about all the technologies which have been tested and which have failed, and the technologies which have been tested and been successful during that project. I want to highlight that one technology, which is this. You can look it up yourself, discharge.ch. You can also download the application on Android Play Store, free of charge, and then play around with this kind of technology. It is a technology with which you can measure discharge with a smartphone. As I said before, in a small channel, for example, irrigation channel, you can also measure wastewater flows in a wastewater pipe, whatever. Or you can go to large-scale irrigation channels or to small to medium-sized rivers. So what you do with this type of technology, it is a technology which relies on the optical sensor in the smartphone, which uses the smartphone camera to measure discharge. I'm going to show you. I would like to walk you through the steps of how you can, how a user can get started with this type of technology and then start to collect data on a regular interval without being a hydromet professional herself or himself, okay? So let's look at this little channel here. What you do, first you identify the site where you as an individual, on behalf of somebody else or simply because you're interested, want to measure discharge in a channel. Then, second step, you have to calibrate the site. Calibration involves putting 4 markers. Here we spray painted the 4 markers. Measuring the intermarker distances. So how far is this distance? How far is this distance? This distance, this distance, this distance, this distance. And lastly, measure the profile. In this example, it's a rectangular profile. You can also think of parabolic profiles, trapezoidal profiles, or even free profiles, which are then becoming increasingly more difficult to measure as the complexity of the profile increases. So this is what we call site setup and site calibration. And this site is now calibrated. Once you have done this, you can create the site, this let's say gauging site, while you are actually in the field on your mobile phone. You can capture with the GPS the location, you enter these data in your application, and the data point is then stored. Next, what do? You can start to measure. So this profiling and calibration you do once. And then the profiling, if the profile is subject to change over time, you do it at the regular interval again throughout the year, maybe twice a year or whatever, for example, hydromet sector is mandating. So then you measure. And here, measuring basically just entails using the smartphone, going to the location and taking a film of 4 to 5 seconds from this discharge situation, okay? And what you do then is, let me try to run the film again over here. What you do then is you have to translate the real world coordinates into the image coordinates, and you use your thumb to tell the application where the markers are on the images or on the film, okay? This is what you see here. And then this technology knows how to knows basically how many pixels correspond to what length in the image. So we have sort of a scale, okay? What we do, put a scale. Then, the next step, you either measure the water level only, you can swipe it up with your finger and then optically identify the water level. And you have a discharge water level curve relationship and can translate this water level automatically using this relationship into a discharge at a particular location. Very simple. So you only measure water level optically. Well, you adjust the water level, or you type it in according to maybe there's also a staff gauge, or then you actually measure the surface wave pattern and the water level, and assume a particular velocity decay over the profile depth, so as to calculate for the particular site a bulk velocity, And then using the area velocity method, you arrive at the discharge. Okay, so what you have, bulk velocity times area, and then you arrive at the velocity. And you see here, as an example, this film is now being processed, which I've taken at that site. It takes some time. Voila, it's still calculating. It's taking some time because it does particle image velocity tracking. Okay, and then uses this typical decay profile with a Manning roughness coefficient here to arrive at the velocity decay. And you see here, then these little arrows, they are indication of the surface velocity over the whole visible profile section. And if you measure a couple of times the water depth and the discharge, so you go there today, you go there tomorrow, you go there the day after tomorrow, you go there repeatedly again, what you can do is build up a discharge water level relationship over time using only this device. And then as you build that up, you sort of arrive at the fitted curve, which is the least square fit. Once you have done these measurements, either water level and velocity, you automatically, once you have a GSM connection, you can automatically synchronize the data with a web backend. And you see here a picture of this web backend. If you go to the website, you can also sign up and familiarize yourself with this web backend. You can create users, organizations, have a whole measurement hierarchy. You can create and manage sites. You can accept and reject measurements. And you can review the data and export the data and also use these type of data as a bridge to another service. For example, a forecasting service. When you want to forecast, let's say, given the data you have, forecast discharge at the particular location you're interested in using some statistical methods as an example. Okay, so this is basically just to give you an overview of one of the technologies which has surfaced out of this particular initiative, this IMOMO initiative, which is, I think, a nice example of these low-cost, people-centered, high-tech crowd-sensing initiatives, which are popping up globally. Now, what you ask, I talked about this already a little bit. What are the application arenas for such a technology? Here you see order of magnitude centimeters. Okay, this is a small irrigation ditch, a line one. Then order of magnitude is meters, so you can also measure that. And then as you go, this is an intake in Eastern Africa here. This is like 5-6 meters intake to a large irrigation system, sugarcane plantation, and then a small-scale river. And here we have even an example of a river in Zurich, which is the River Limmat here. This is just below a power station in Zurich. Oops, it was a little bit short. It's 30 meters diameter. Okay. So this is sort of the application arenas. And you see here, I specifically mention on-farm and off-farm. So on-farm is basically inside irrigation communities, whereas off-farm is basically for hydromet agencies in the context of official gauging. You can also use this type of technology. Yeah? So very important to acknowledge. Now you come, what is the precision of this type of technology? And as any other technology, it has its limits. We have to acknowledge that. And what you see here, I tried to make a little bit of a clumsy drawing here. There's a sort of a profile size. So how big is the profile? Is it centimeters? Is it meters? Tens of meters? And what is the profile type? And if you're in a sort of a small-scale geometry situation, you look at the typical error and the well-defined profile, rectangular, trapezoidal, or parabolic profile. You look at an error which is normally below 5%. Yeah. A pretty good precision. And as you increase the profile size, and as the width of the discharge body becomes bigger, and as the profile gets free, because it's pretty for example, it's a riverbed, we move into errors of 10 to 20% depending on the site. And very importantly, because it's an optical method, it's not a propeller method, for example, things which you haven't thought of before can also impact your precision. For example, if you have a large river and the water is flowing this way, but wind is flowing that way, and wind creates surface ripples, okay? Making the technology think that water is actually flowing uphill. So these are conditions which have to be carefully studied and are site dependent. And also, lightning conditions can sometimes be difficult if you have a lot of contrast because the sun is, for example, setting in your visible range. So that's an issue that has to be carefully studied. So, very important point, you can't just blindly trust any ever so cool technology which you think is actually fun and interesting to use, but still be careful if you really want to use these data then for either operational, management or planning purposes at a later stage. In the context of water resource management organizations or in the official context. There is interesting value propositions of this type of technology. As you can imagine, and as I mentioned at the beginning, as compared to this fixed location, traditional monitoring systems, it scales and the cost precision trade-off in many circumstances is very favorable. The technology is also interesting because in the very sense of crowd sensing, it can be utilized by non-professionals and amateurs. Okay? You're doing this non-contact representative measurements, representative. Why representative? Because you look at the velocity, surface velocity of the entire discharge situation. In the case of a propeller, it's not a representative measurement, but you have to calculate the bulk velocity, doing many measurements across the profile over different depths, different bandwidths. Okay. Vandalism is in most cases not an issue with this type of technology. Error-free data transmission is also very important because you can synchronize the data immediately with a web backend. And it's evidence-based, and one shouldn't underestimate this. It's very important. There's this fun anecdote from India where this friend of mine on a consultancy mission went to an official gauge reader and wanted to get the latest data from his daily gauge reading effort. He didn't find the data at home, but he found his wife, the wife of the gauge reader. And so the wife of the gauge reader said, "Oh, which data do you need, from this week or next week?" You know, so it's like a lot of these data which we read or which are produced these days can be fake data. And with a technology like this, because it's optical technologies, for each measurement you have a proof which is geolocated and time-stamped. Okay? So each of these, this is a particular site in Tanzania which has been monitored for 2 years now. So for each measurement you have a geolocated, time-stamped proof image, which is very interesting when we talk about the evidence-based measurements and the requirements for this. Now this was sort of a technology background. I just want to give you 2 quick examples of how we actually went about deploying this technology successfully in 2 places in Eastern Africa. This is a snapshot of where measurements are being taken currently with this technology. And I want to give you an example of the field level water availability, a measurement campaign just carried out in Mozambique, and an official gauging campaign where a Ministry of Water in Tanzania is using this type of technology to measure official sites. Now, these are 2 quick examples I want to walk you through to show you how we deployed this technology. Not just broadcasting to people, hey, you can download now a new technology, why don't you start to measure, but actually working very closely with people to root this in a sustainable and durable way in communities or ministries. So here in this context of a large-scale irrigation renewal program in Mozambique, which is supported by, among others, by the World Bank and IFPRI, we were mapping and equipping 3 small-scale schemes. These are 100 hectares, 50 hectares, 20 hectares here, with this type of technology to estimate field-scale water availability over time. Okay? And the goal of the study was to actually look at the irrigation efficiency of the individual farmers and see if the farmers are being provided with feedback of how much water they actually use over the season. Maybe they could adjust their rigid and fixed irrigation rotation schedules to a more flexible, more optimal management schemes. And the most important people are obviously our crowd senders. This is Paolo, as an example. He is from Namandembe, the scheme over there. And they have been collecting 25 points together with another person on a daily basis for almost 2 years now. And this is the intake point of this scheme. Here you see the scheme, intake point, and then canal points here along the way. And you see that this is a snapshot from the data from the intake. You see here the Southern African region was running a huge drought last year and the year before. So this is as we move into the drought and then have a very bad small irrigation season, how the irrigation water availability at the intake recovered slightly. And the very interesting thing is that you can even capture the short duration, high intensity precipitation events with this type of stuff. And here you see the recession curve of the water availability in the intake. Now, if you do these calculations and factor in the water, the field size and the water availability along the tertiary, secondary canals, you can actually arrive at the field scale water availability. And this is what I mentioned before. The blue lines, these are the intake flows, and the red lines, this is CMORPH precipitation data, where you see even short duration, high intensity precipitation events are being captured then on the water side. This is as we move into the drought and have only a slight recovery. This is again recession curve. And this year the rainy season is much better than last year, so we have some significant recovery here. You see that this is the latest data, just which I plotted yesterday. Okay, and then obviously we can also study over time the irrigation water availability at the field scale for the individual farmers, and then work with the farmers for feedback. An interesting finding here was that most farmers are actually over-irrigating in the dry region there because of many reasons. Okay, then a second example. This is an example from official gauging, which I want to give you. Is the Pangani River Basin in Tanzania here. This is 4 times the size of Switzerland or 16 times the size of Lebanon, just for size comparison. And we have been working a particular tributary to the river and then also along official gauging sites with the Ministry of Water to use that technology for the official gauging. And people use it in both ways, to either look at staff gauges, type in water levels, or use their thumbs to identify water level optically, or measure discharge and water levels at the particular sites, and then arrive at the different data. Here is the level, and here is the velocity, and then you arrive at the particular discharge for a site under consideration. So, now, again, you see here that most importantly, we really always were working very hard with the people, either with the ministries or with the irrigation community people, to get this properly off the ground. And sort of one of the very important and global learnings was that you're either looking at highly structured places or weakly structured places. A highly structured context, as for example in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, where you have very strict workflows and very well-defined workflows in the context of irrigation water management, is that these type of crowd sensing technologies help to modernize existing workflows. But that they meet initially high reluctance, because it's a new technology, it's not certified, it's unproven. So you have to work very, very hard with officials and also with irrigation, with the water user associations or irrigation communities to actually anchor this technology locally. You can't expect that people will just take it up and start to use it, because there is mistrust, there is lack of certification, there is other requirements which are not clear. For example, also, who, if not already available, who will buy a smartphone, who will buy the data packages and all that kind of stuff. Weakly structured context, this is what we often see in Eastern Africa as an example, that the management of water resources is more ad hoc, and it's of course regulated, but it is not always adhered to so closely as it is actually described in law, in the code. And so there, what we saw is that these innovation technologies are much easier to deploy, because you can sort of start afresh, because you have little technology to start with, or little culture of measurement to start with. So very easy deployment if you work closely and carefully with the people. So this is important to acknowledge. So whereas in the highly structured context, I prefer to speak about the modernization, in the weakly structured context, I prefer to speak about the innovation component a little bit more. In order to get this going, in order to have a sustained crowdsourced data campaign ensured, where you get data which you can actually use in decision making, in the context of irrigation water management, which is the focus of my talk, you should follow, and this is also sort of our global template of how you go about in bringing the technologies to the field, the following 5 steps. First, you start to obviously work with the communities or with the ministry or the Department of Water Resources, site identification, mapping, needs, requirements identification, then the instrumentation and calibration. Here you see this intake again, and these are much bigger spray painted points because the geometry is bigger. So this is what I showed you before, profiling. And then with the crowd senders, you define a protocol for the collection of data, at which frequency, at which time, at which location you want to have measured what. And you do that contractually, you ensure that you have this contractual relationship in place, and you also make sure that their operational costs are covered, because you can't expect an irrigation community on behalf of the ministry, for example, to suddenly invest money and time without being adequately remunerated. We're not talking about big things. For example, our crowd senders in Mozambique down there, they're now performing these data collection things with 50 cents per day per person, something like this, or 20 cents even, something like this. And then you do the data collection, and very importantly, not to forget, is quality assurance, quality control at the end. And if you have these 5 things in place, then you're robust, and then you have achieved a sort of a sustainable deployment. Now this brings me to the conclusion. Context matters, as I mentioned before. Then no free lunch. We can't expect, in the context of water resource management, in developing and transitional economics in the semi-arid and arid regions, that simply because these technologies are now available or start to become more and more available, that everybody will start to contribute to increase data coverage in data scarce and water scarce regions. The crowd sensing can be successfully deployed, and it can help you gather better data, or the interested agency help gather better data if it is properly done. And I should also say that while my talk had a focus on the water quantity side, what applies to water quality is increasingly also becoming interesting. And the water quality side, for example, in Bangladesh, there is where it was witnessed one of the biggest mass poisoning problems on the planet, because people drink arsenic groundwater. So there you can map where is the access to your safest, closest, safest safe water point, Or you also have with this Aqua initiative or these Aqua guys, non-governmental organizations, they focus a lot on the water quality side, also using some optical methods, looking at the pH of water and stuff like that. So what applies to water quantity can also be, to a certain extent, translated to water quality. So with this, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, should there be, hopefully.
I have a few questions about the technology itself. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I have a few questions about the technology itself. So, can I use this technology with a lower smartphone? Can I use this technology offline and then maybe upload it later? Also, can I use it with a drone, which would, I think, make it much easier also?
With a drone?
Yeah.
Yes. You can use the technology with a low-end smartphone. You have to make sure that you have an adequate resolution on the camera side. Huh?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're maybe looking at the 150 USD to 200 USD investment for a smartphone, something like that. You can use the smartphone offline, anywhere. You're in the bush somewhere, okay? You don't have a GSM connection. As soon as you're in reach of the network again, you can synchronize with the cloud. So you can do as many measurements offline and then synchronize. A drone measurement is oh God, disaster. Drone measurement is an interesting idea. It hasn't been tried, but I think it's an interesting idea. The interesting point about that idea is because if you have, let me make that drawing. If you have, let's say, a riverside, and you have, I don't know, 30 to 40 meters, or 50, let's say 50 meters, the human is, you would have to build a big ladder so you can actually look down on the scene, okay? So why don't you use a drone, like this is my drawing of a drone, and then look down. I like the idea, yeah. Why not? Yeah. And you can also stabilize, so yeah, good idea.
My question about the offline use was the fact that it exists in some apps, not really this. I can take the data with the phone, then later upload it for the processing or the calculations to happen on a server or somewhere.
Same here, you can do that, yeah. So you don't have to be online while in the field taking data. So.
All that can extremely improves the accessibility of this technology.
Yes, I agree, yes. And also you can, I mean, the interesting thing about this technology is also because the smartphone is not just a sensor with the camera, but it's also a computer. So it analyzes the film, the sequence of images on here, and it only sends to the database the value of the discharge or the water level and one image, not the whole film. So there is little data traffic overhead. But still, if you want to minimize the data traffic over the GSM network, you go to a place where you have Wi-Fi and then you can synchronize everything, of course. Yeah. Question?
You had shown, I'm thinking a little bit about responsibility around the technology. Mm-hmm. You had shown a graph where you have a variable confidence interval based off of the profile and then I think you called it the diameter.
Yeah, the size, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, is there an optimum zone that you recommend? I mean, I can't help but think when we're talking about 20% variability, how this would translate for water management. Perhaps it might lend itself to a bit of corruption if you have that level of inaccuracy. I mean, I've heard of many cases where you have governments creating a perceived water crisis, so that they can go ahead and do water grabs, and or just do all sorts of different things. So, is there an optimum zone that at a certain point you recommend?
I mean, a couple of remarks here. If you want to cheat, you can cheat. Point number one. This technology, because it's evidence-based, there is a certain there's a certain proof with an image-based proof on the web backend with what the situation of discharge was at the particular time when you made this measurement, okay? As an advice, I would, especially in the small scale to medium-sized irrigation context, I would always advise to line a particular section, like 3 meters with concrete, with a nice profile, because then you have a good enough precision for a particular site. Should that precision be required? If it's only for compliance monitoring, like precision required when it comes to making a highly precise water balance and so on and so on. But if it's only for compliance monitoring and just a proof image or like a water level would be enough, then it's a different context. So it's again context specific. However, and this is also important to say, let's assume that a particular irrigation manager or a water resource manager is interested in doing a basin scale water balance and looking at the intakes and how these intakes are operated, and maybe also doing trying with this water balance to do some permitting how much water can be extracted given the particular hydrological situation in the particular year. You also want to acknowledge the uncertainty of any type of technology, and we can do that today, for example, with a technology called data assimilation, where you use the Bayesian framework. Every measurement is uncertain, everything is uncertain. You have these uncertain distributions, and with every measurement comes a precision, and the measurements sort of help then to hopefully narrow down the uncertainty around particular state of knowledge. So these are also technology which help us to deal with these type of imprecisions. And of course, I really want to mention and highlight, if you want to have a highly precise, high-frequency measurement at the particular site, for example, every 10 seconds or every hour, I would not recommend such a type of technology, because you cannot expect the human to be there then on time, all the time, the whole day, okay? So it's really context-specific. But this technology helps you to quickly generate knowledge about a particular discharge situation, go from ungauged to gauge in a very quick way, and then maybe also help you identify or help you prioritize investments. For example, looking at the canal stretch, and there is a huge water losses because it's, the lining is kaput or it's not lined at all. And then doing a little water balance along a canal with these type of technologies, you can also prioritize your investments with the money that is as water also scarce. Okay, so these type of things.
Yeah, I mean, just to further that point, you said you're working with people that are crowdsourcing the data, but are you working with the water managers on different scales?
Yes.
To perhaps, at a certain point, maybe say, perhaps you should rely on more traditional methods if you're looking for this, because you're saying context matters. So if you, as experts can understand their context, give your recommendation.
Yes, we have, for example, in Tanzania, I give you a flare of that. We are working with the officials from a Basin Water Office, which is a Ministry of Water branch. Use that technology for measurement of discharge and water level. We saw, or the ministry saw, that at particular sites, the velocity measurement of the surface velocity is not accurate enough. So it biases, the discharge measurement, but the ministry says this is no problem for us. Why is this technology still interesting for them? Because right now, or in many instances, they have to send out hydromet experts. They then do measurements and then, write these measurements down, then fax or telephone or have to go back to the office. In cases where you, for example, have a staff gauge, like a scale, you can use that technology, and even a layman or a non-professional can go there, take a picture and type in the water level, send it immediately to the office. So that is vast because of the modernization, not just of the data acquisition, but also of the of the digitized data transmission side. There is the vast potential for saving. So it really matters, context specific, that it's really hard to sort of generalize, and we would have to look at the case by case in how much or to what extent this type of technology low-cost, high-tech, crowdsourced, individuals, people-based technology can help to answer an agency's or an irrigation community's request. And it might be so that in certain instances it's only about data transmission. It might be so it's about evidence or proving for permitting stuff, or it might be so that it's actually being used operationally for water balance and water balance assessments at basin scale. So these are different users and different users which can maybe use such type of technology to help to make their workflows more efficient, to use less capital as input for the whole measurement campaign, and also to complement their gaps with this type of technology. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Maybe one comment and one question. I can translate this, I guess, especially for Central Asia in quite a few other useful contexts. I think about rural hydropower schemes where we always have problems with losses, there also be discharge. But if we come back to agriculture, I'm not quite sure if this is the second or third step before the first. Our biggest challenge, especially with subsistence farmers, was usually that nobody could say this soil, this crop needs how much irrigation. You mentioned the over-irrigation, it's a huge problem. And I wonder if this cloud-based technology wouldn't allow as well a simple and also with an error margin of 10-20% would be completely
good enough
to say, okay, in this geographical location, in this season, this soil, this crop, we need approximately this and this discharge. This would be for me the first very, very useful step.
Can I quickly answer to that? I think it's a very important point. I mean, the whole how suitable is my land for the particular crop choice? That's a very basic question. I mean,
but not say no if the crop is suitable for the land. Question, even if I ask them to experts, what would be the optimum irrigation? How many cubic meters do we need for sowing so much acres? Oh, we need to do a huge study. No, I need, especially in this error margin, just a hint to optimize this. And that would be my idea or question, if it's also possible to translate crowd data in such a sense for particular regions to say, okay, we give you a first, and then we use that to also
to operationalize the monitoring, the actual state. Yes, I agree. I mean, I have this little experience from this particular Kenyan farmer who happened to migrate to Tanzania, and he had exactly these problems. He said, I don't know anything about the particular situation here, whereas in Kenya, my government gave me advice, how much water I typically need on a land like this, using watermelon as a crop, for example. And so this is a very important and basic step, and I believe that there is also potential for using this type of technology in an environment like this and in a question like this. So yes, and I agree with you. It's of course it's a first step. I have been talking about measuring discharge with an application for water balance or permitting or operationalization, cost effectiveness accounting. But this is a very important point you're making, and I believe that there is also potential for crowd sensing there. Does this answer your question a bit?
Yeah. I just wonder who would follow something like that up. No? Probably not you now, but this is for me always.
Yeah, it's we have, when we did this field scale water availability accounting. This is also a bit going in a similar direction. How much water is flowing? The one thing which is important to work with the education communities, but then have the extension officers in the background, providing regular follow-up and support. So, it's not the Muzungus, me, going from Switzerland all the time down there and then, doing this remote consultation. But it's actually putting a structure in place locally where you have immediately the ability as, a crowd center to have my questions answered. With, in this case, an extension officer which is coming regularly to visit and follow up. And also, which does the quality assurance and quality control, because this person can go there and say, look, this looks fishy, from a water balance perspective, it doesn't make sense and stuff like that. So very important and very important. It's like a pyramid scheme, to have like a pyramid scheme with the crowd centers at the end, at the base, and then having different levels of responsibilities put in place, yes. Not a Ponzi scheme, but a pyramid scheme. Questions?
Yeah. You've talked about the applications in open canals. I'm thinking about my field of work. Could this be applied to a pipe? Not a closed pipe, like obviously.
If you make a window in a pipe, yes.
Of course. It could, has it been tried?
Yeah, for example, in Germany, we work with a big hydromet company in looking into canalization. You open the ditch and then you have these half pipes and there is the dirt, the wastewater flowing, and then people look with the camera from the ditch down there, yes. But you need a window into the flow situation. Yes.
I'm thinking like at the beginning of the wastewater treatment, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
totally.
It's accurate enough.
Questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. First of all, it's quite remarkable. But what's interesting now, as a summary to their questions, what's next for the application in terms of reducing errors, having more operationalizing in more different sectors? How do you see this application for the next 5 years, especially that technology is improving quite fast nowadays?
Yeah, very big questions. Yeah, the vision of this application is now also in conjunction with the work we've been doing with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation to what the development agencies like to call outscaling, to increase the footprint of this technology and see whether or not this kind of technology is interesting for local stakeholders. So we have been working in quite a number of Eastern African countries to gauge interest there. It's kind of hard for me to tell that I would love to see the whole world using this application in the context of crowd sense discharge measurement. It's obviously an interesting vision, but I cannot guarantee you. I'm interested to see new users and users popping up out of own interest, with a sort of an increasing footprint that we hope to achieve. It can also be that it develops its own life in a domain where we didn't even think of before. What is certain, so this technology, as any other technology, needs sort of a sustained development. This is what you alluded to it. It can't just be, okay, now we have something which is more or less working with a more or less acceptable error. The importance is that this technology is continuously developed, also based, or continuously further developed, also based on user input from different corners of the world. And with regard to this requires investment into the technology. And for this, we are also studying sort of smart business models that you can subscribe, on a sort of with a particular data package. So the basic philosophy of this business model is, if you want to contribute to an open data world, then all your measurement is free. Every measurement will be free. But if you, because you're an agency and you want to hide your data, you want to make it private, then you would have to pay, depending on the locations where you are. And so this open data philosophy versus private data would then have impact on the business plan in the back, and so also help to develop some regular income and help to finance further development. It's very important that this technology of measuring discharge with an optical sensor, the smartphone camera, is just one end application of the whole sort of, we have an application, we have the possibility to transmit data digitally to a database, then do data management, data export, data analysis, and bridges to, let's say, forecasting services, as I mentioned before. Very important. But you could also think of that you could use that type of technology to connect to another type of sensor, maybe an external sensor, maybe soil moisture, or maybe you name it, okay? So, with little additional effort and acknowledging modularity of this technology, which is built around the smartphone universe, you can actually envision quite a zoo of new ideas and new technologies popping up for crowd sensing, water data, other types of water data, or atmospheric data as well.
I do think crowdsourcing is for sure a big part of the future of environmental data collection, all sorts. So I want to commend you guys on making sense of it, because it does require a lot of sense making. But I wanted to ask, what else are you doing to engage these crowdsourcers on a digital level? I mean, you're talking face-to-face, and I do think that's important at this stage, but is there any incentives that you're incorporating into the actual app that would make people more inclined to source?
We thought a brilliant idea at the beginning, because we started off, and they're like, oh my God, this is so cool, everybody can measure stuff. So what we're going to do is like a emoji thing, or there was this bird, okay, which lives in an app. So we made like a serious game, okay, inside the app, which was a bird living in a very dry, arid environment, a very sad bird. And the more data you collected, okay, the more green would the environment turn, the vegetation would become lush, and the bird would start to smile and jump up and down. It's like, it was very naive to think that this will motivate people. But it was a trial, it was a trial. So this was we worked with people or experts from this serious games corner together to develop some new incentives or innovations or incentives for people to actually collect more data, and sort of to reach a new goal. But that was, I think, a little bit on the naive side, in retrospective. But still, it was fun to sort of check it out. But that's again, people who appreciate that kind of stuff. I think this is really a first world problem. I mean, then let's say you go to sub-Saharan Africa, and you show the people that you have some bird jumping up and down if you do 20 measurements, and this guy says, yeah, I still have to feed my 10 people, but my 10-head family, I have different types of problems. So it was very much a sort of, I think, in retrospective, total bullshit. But anyway, it was an interesting learning, yes. And it can work in different contexts. People, it's like a little bit this Pokemon stuff and so. Does this answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. More questions? No more questions? Yeah.
Experience. Where was this technology more successful in practical terms, like in which kind of water management planning sector?
Yeah. It's very simple. Where the users have needs which can be answered with this type of technologies. So, for example, when the basin manager says, look, I have huge costs because my basin is so big, with all that professional hydromet staff running around the whole year making these measurements with car, 2 hydromet specialists, then the whole mechanical staff, then when it can make the whole effort of data collection cheaper at the sort of, at the favorable cost precision trade-off on the a particular point on the curve, the cost-precision trade-off, then you have answered his or her needs. And when you can do that, then you are successful. So, for example, in Tanzania, in the context of official monitoring in the Rufiji Basin, as well as in the Pangani Basin, this has been successfully deployed. It has been terribly unsuccessful with irrigation communities in the same country here. Because these irrigation communities, though they by law, would have to pay for water at their intake going into their irrigation perimeter, and because you can play the game of interest that, since by law these would have to pay, so by common sense, they would also want to know whether they get the water for which they pay, as well as the government off-farm would want to know how much water they deliver and whether they get the money for the water they delivered. So the game of interest, both parties have an interest. It even doesn't work because it's so weakly structured, and there is so much wheeling and dealing, and permits not being enforced, payments not being made properly. So it's again, maybe this is not a satisfactory answer, but if a particular water manager has a particular problem and this technology makes his life easier, then it's a win-win situation. Otherwise, it's more a steep ascent with regard to, okay, we talk also about certification, we talk about comparison measurements, we talk about familiarizing yourself with the technology, and it takes time. So this can take 1 year, and then the government would, for example, say, okay, now I have confidence that this technology is worthwhile investing, I invest in it. So, more questions?
Other than agriculture use, maybe this is more of a comment, but I can see this being used as well for personal use. For example, if someone's living near a stream that they rely on and they think it might be polluted, they can use, in terms of the water quality data, you think they can use it to check?
There is also different initiatives of, for example, in the US, but also for example, in Zanzibar, in Eastern Africa, where users can report pollution points, for example. So, you take a picture, it's geolocated, timestamp, you upload it to a database, and everybody can see this is the culprit. So, yes, very much so. Now, I have a question. What do you see the potential of this type of technology in Lebanon? Is there a potential for this type of technology, or is it kind of like a nice to have, nice to see, or you're the experts here, so I rely on your input.
We have a severe lack of data in Lebanon, severe lack, and almost no data, at least almost no constant data.
So it's a yes. I take it as a yes.
It's definitely yes. I can see it. I work at the Ministry of Environment. So I can see it, of course, in the agricultural field. Of course, you can track. We have a huge problem with the Litani River nowadays. So you can maybe track the flow in different areas of the river where the river is. It's like it gets cut, then it comes back. Maybe in some places you can track how much sewage is coming into the river. You don't have to go there. You can send people with this simple application. Someone from municipality, for example, you should send him to the place where the sewage is going into the river. Just tell me how much sewage approximately is going into the river at different locations. This is a quick example I can think of. When you go to inspect wastewater treatment plants, this is why I asked my question. So even the operators of the wastewater treatment plant have no idea how much water they're treating. They have an approximate idea of how much water they're treating. So again, this could be extremely useful.
And the nice thing with wastewater, I mean, it's not nice wastewater, but the nice thing with wastewater, using the optical technology, obviously, is that it has, when you look at the fresh water, clean water, sometimes it's an issue that you have little contrast of the surface pattern. And you don't have the problem with wastewater, you have all that flotilla going with the wastewater. So it helps to improve the precision of the technology. This flotilla of stuff in there.
Even in a pipe?
If you see inside the pipe, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo your point. Definitely major data gaps that limit the quality of research that we can do, and then
Yeah. Research is also interesting.
yeah, of course, and then how well informed the decisions are at the top level. I really question that. But the other thing that I think is especially important for Lebanon is how this is not static, and you're not going to have an issue with vandalism, as you mentioned. There's been cases of water metering in Lebanon, and people seem to be, and I think this is a case for a lot of the developing world, not so trusting of technologies coming into their communities. So, you know, there was a case, and I'm not going to say where they actually destroyed the water meters. You know, and so the fact that you don't have an actual physical device there all the time, and you can rely on, you know, statistical analysis to later come up with constant discharge.
It's very important.
Yeah, is big opportunity here.
You know, I have a very funny anecdote with regard to vandalism. So there is this site, Kikoletwat Karangai, in Pangani River Basin. And it's, you know, 20 meters in diameter. And the Ministry of Water, they put a metal cable that you can put your boat on and then do these, you know, propeller measurements. So this metal cable is no longer there. After one day, they put it there. And the cattle over here, you know, the Maasai cattle, okay, they use the cable to bind the cattle to the trees. So even the most basic stuff, just the metal cable, you know, everything is gone. So it's a big problem. Yeah.
Another use, I can imagine nowadays, another issue that we're having is the refugee camps.
Yeah.
We have them by the thousands, and that's another way to maybe track the whole these camps, both incoming and outgoing, without the need for permanent meters.
It's also very interesting now that you mentioned this. There was a recent study. This is a research project by Oxford University, and they found something very interesting. They looked at data from hand pumps all over sub-Saharan Africa, a particular type of hand pumps. And they found by monitoring these hand pumps that when the people pump, also in camps or stuff like that, you can, with these high frequency vibrations you hear, by listening to the vibrations, you can deduce the water level of the groundwater. Very beautiful, like a totally unexpected application. And all this kind of stuff, you know, this is all in this innovation corner and this popping up everywhere. So good ideas, and also for refugee situations or camp situations, you have to, where you have huge problems created overnight. This is something which is very relevant. Also, and especially viewed from the context of sustainable resource management, also groundwater, not just surface water.
I missed the first 10 minutes. Is the app available for anyone?
Yes, you can download it, and I hope you can also distribute the PDF. And otherwise, you can just send me an email, and then I can share you all the information. It's freely available, Android, App Store. You can download it. You can also sign up on the website, discharge.ch, and then there's also the manual available, and feel free to ask me any questions if you have.
That's what I wanted to ask. Is it available on App Store?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I see it on Google Play.
Play Store, sorry. Oh my God. Not the iOS App Store, but Google Play Store.
First word problem.
Yeah.
Is it coming soon?
To iOS? No. You know why? You know, who has an iPhone in the developing and transitional? But I have an iPhone myself, and it would be most beautiful to have it on the iPhone. But we just have to prioritize the development. So.
Just I want to point it also came late that, as you noticed, we videoing this lecture, and it will be available on our website very soon.
Question?
Yeah, just another point. We have quite a high unemployment rate, especially among young adults. So, and you know, again, the refugee crisis is compounding that even more. But what I foresee is if you could somehow institutionalize this technology within the Ministry of Energy and Water or Ministry of Environment, well then you could, this is a potential for, potential incentive, you could, people could be crowdsourcing data, but also building a skill set on how to use this technology really, really well, and perhaps you can create some,
Very important point. And you know what, it also helps, this type of people-centered technology, it helps to improve understanding, local understanding also of resource dynamics. It also gives the crowd centers a sort of it gives them some sort of pride to be involved, in this type of campaign. So that's also what we observe, and it's something which one shouldn't underestimate. That is sort of community building and community practice building. Very interesting and important. Yeah.
Does the app have like different profiles, or you can prove how many measurements you have taken?
You mean profiles cross sections or profiles
no,
like
as personal profiles?
What you can do is you can set up, let's say, an organization, okay? Let's say Ministry of Environment, okay? Lebanon. And these organizations can have like sub-branches, like, this Basin organization, this Basin organization, this Basin organization. And within each sub-branch, you have then crowd centers linked to, okay? So you have a whole profile hierarchy, and you can also set, who sees what, who is the manager of whom, who is the responsible person. So this is all implemented. And
well, what I had in mind is probably to monetize it in a way that a person can get, people can get paid per measurement, for example, or in a sense, like to have it over a large scale.
So you talk about how people could get rewarded now?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is the contractual side and not necessarily linked to the app. I mean, what you could think of, for example, in Eastern Africa, there is this M-Pesa credit system via mobile phone. You have a USSD session on the phone, and you can immediately transfer, let's say, 20 cents or 20 francs or 20 USD to your account just by sending an SMS or by opening a USSD session on the phone. And so something like this could be also envisioned. That an easier reward or remuneration channel could be set up parallel to the whole app, which is sort of collecting data. One could also think it's actually an interesting idea that you have user accounts which are also linked to a sort of credit, okay, or and then you could sort of recharge given your particular contract and your remuneration or your reward scheme, or the bank account could go down. What we have now is that we have all this, the accounting in the background, but this reward system is not yet in there. But I like the idea.
Especially for people in rural areas.
Yeah.
You can hire people everywhere.
No, it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Just building on that point, the point I was making earlier is that if you were to institutionalize this somehow, in the meantime, because maybe right now you haven't found a strong incentive for crowdsourcing, and that would probably come with time. But in the meantime, it could be something that, lay people trying to get jobs of a basic nature could be working for, let's say, the Ministry of Water and Energy, and in the meantime, they would be, helping fill these massive data gaps that we have, while you guys are further developing your user friendliness.
If the ministry is willing to, it's interesting doing something like that. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Right. And you haven't had any case where you have, even at the municipal level, sort of institutionalization?
In Uganda, yes. And maybe there's also some movement coming up in this direction in Ethiopia. Yeah. But in Uganda, this institutionalization has happened, yes. Yeah. There was a question there.
I just had a question to follow up on what you were saying before about feeling a sense of ownership or pride in data because you're collecting the data. Have you seen a trend in that actually changing behavior in water use, for example, in irrigation schemes?
What we did in Mozambique to a certain extent was, but this was an intentional campaign for then bringing back to the communities data with various type of approaches, mapping, discussions, deliberate discussions, for making the whole irrigation scheduling more flexible and efficient. But this is quite some work and quite a progress. And people, because it works, otherwise people would have changed. Stick to their fixed rotation schedule. In many cases, that is inefficient irrigation and even over-irrigation. And people are, in that sense, not aware of what their flexibility is. So yes, we have tried that, but it's work. And again, it shouldn't be the work of, let's say, the app developers or the initiative developers, but it should then be the work of the extension service or the work of the ministry to, go back, enforce payments, sensitize people to, a water balance that is getting close because more and more irrigation is popping, and all these kind of things. Yes. Yeah. More questions? No more questions? Audience exhausted. Well, thank you so much for coming. And I have here my cards, and feel free to send me an email or go to website, and I can also share presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.